The light fades in a quiet room, and in that gentle dimming, something stirs. Not a sound, not a movement, but a presence. The invisible self emerges when the world grows quiet, when the performance ends and the audience leaves. It whispers the stories no one else hears, the unspoken fears, the secret hopes, the memories that cling like morning fog. We spend our days building personas, crafting versions of ourselves that fit neatly into the expectations of others. We become the reliable friend, the competent colleague, the cheerful presence. But behind these carefully constructed masks, another self waits. It doesn't speak in words, but in feelings. A sudden ache in the chest, a wave of nostalgia for something never experienced, a longing that has no name. This invisible self carries our most authentic truths, the parts we hide not out of shame, but out of survival. It holds the childhood wonder we were told to outgrow, the vulnerability we learned to armor, the dreams we tucked away for being too impractical. In a world that values visibility, likes, shares, attention, the invisible self becomes our most private sanctuary and our deepest loneliness. What happens when we stop performing and start listening? When we turn our attention inward, toward the whispers we've spent a lifetime ignoring? The invisible self doesn't demand to be seen by others. It asks only to be acknowledged by us. It's the part that remembers who we were before the world told us who to be. In the silence between heartbeats, in the space between breaths, the invisible self waits. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a truth to be embraced. It's the shadow that gives depth to our light, the silence that makes music meaningful, the emptiness that gives form to everything. Perhaps loneliness isn't the absence of others, but the distance we create from ourselves. Perhaps being seen begins not with finding someone who understands us, but with understanding the parts of ourselves we've made invisible. Carl Jung called this hidden aspect the shadow self, the repository of everything we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. It contains not just our darkness, but our light too. The talents we dismiss as insignificant, the passions we call impractical, the sensitivity we label as weakness. The shadow isn't what's wrong with us, it's what's complete about us that we've learned to fragment. Meanwhile, Donald Winnicott's concept of the true self and false self reveals how early in life we learn to hide. The false self develops as a protective mechanism, a social adaptation that helps us navigate the world safely. It learns what's acceptable, what earns approval, what keeps us from being rejected. The true self retreats into privacy, becoming what Winnicott called the incommunicado element, the core of our being that remains untouched by external demands. This creates the central paradox of modern identity. We feel most disconnected when we're most connected to others. The more we perform our socially acceptable selves, the more distant we become from our authentic experience. The invisible self isn't a failure of connection. It's the consequence of too much connection of the wrong kind. We live in an age of unprecedented visibility. Yet, we've never felt more unseen. Social media gives us platforms to broadcast our lives, but rarely the space to be truly known. We curate our existence for public consumption, editing out the messy, complicated human parts that don't fit the narrative. The invisible self becomes everything that doesn't make the final cut. This isn't about deception or inauthenticity in the moral sense. It's about survival. We learn early that certain emotions are too big, certain questions are too disruptive, certain truths are too uncomfortable. So we create compartments, the public self that functions, achieves, relates, and the private self that feels, questions, dreams. The tragedy isn't that we have an invisible self, but that we've been taught to see it as a problem rather than a sanctuary. We mistake its silence for emptiness, its privacy for deficiency. We rush to fill the quiet spaces with noise, to illuminate the shadows with artificial light, forgetting that some truths can only be heard in silence. Some growth can only happen in darkness. The invisible self isn't waiting to be fixed or exposed. It's waiting to be integrated, to be brought into conversation with the parts of us that navigate the world. This isn't about eliminating the false self. We need social adaptation to function, but about restoring communication between our public and private realities. When Jung spoke of the shadow, he wasn't describing something to be eliminated, but something to be made conscious. The shadow contains everything we've disowned, not just our anger or jealousy, but our creativity, our intuition, our capacity for wonder. Making the unconscious conscious isn't about fixing ourselves. It's about becoming more whole. The process begins with noticing what we automatically hide. The sudden tears that come during a happy moment. The flash of anger at someone's innocent comment. The daydream that feels more real than reality. These aren't interruptions to our carefully constructed lives. They're messages from the invisible self, trying to communicate what our conscious mind has forgotten. Winnicott's true self exists in what he called the potential space, the transitional area between inner reality and external world. This is where creativity lives, where play happens, where we're most authentically ourselves. The false self, while necessary for social functioning, can become so dominant that it walls off this potential space, leaving us feeling hollow despite outward success. The invisible self communicates through what psychologists call affect, the raw, emotional experience before we label it, before we decide if it's appropriate. A sudden heaviness in the chest, a lightness that makes you want to dance, a restlessness that has no obvious cause. These are the fingerprints of the true self, the evidence of an inner reality that exists independently of external circumstances. We often mistake the invisible self for our problems. Depression becomes something to medicate away rather than listen to. Anxiety becomes a disorder to manage rather than a signal that something in our life needs attention. Creativity becomes a hobby rather than a vital expression of our deepest self. The work of integration isn't about making the invisible self visible to others. It's about making it visible to ourselves. It's the practice of turning toward our experience with curiosity rather than judgment, of asking, "What is this feeling trying to tell me?" rather than, "How do I make this feeling go away?" This requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, the ability to contain conflicting emotions without rushing to resolve them, to feel both confident and insecure, both connected and alone, both certain and doubtful. The invisible self thrives in this complexity, in the grey areas where simple answers don't reach. Modern psychology often pathologizes this inner complexity. We're encouraged to be consistent, predictable, stable. But the human soul isn't linear. It's cyclical, contradictory, mysterious. The invisible self knows this truth intimately. It doesn't seek resolution so much as expression. The most profound moments of connection often happen when we stop trying to connect and simply allow ourselves to be present with our own experience. In that space, the boundary between inner and outer softens. We realize that the loneliness we've been running from isn't the absence of others, but the absence of ourselves. The invisible self isn't a problem to be solved through better communication or more authentic self-expression. It's a dimension of being that requires a different kind of attention, one that listens rather than analyzes, that receives rather than interprets, that allows rather than directs. There comes a moment in every life when the performance becomes too heavy to maintain, when the masks we wear no longer feel like protection but like prisons. This isn't failure, it's invitation. An invitation to meet the parts of ourselves we've been keeping in the shadows. The turning point isn't dramatic, it's quiet. A Tuesday afternoon when you realize you've been holding your breath. A conversation where you hear yourself saying words that don't feel like yours. A moment of solitude that feels less like loneliness and more like homecoming. This is where psychology meets poetry, where theory becomes lived experience. The concepts of shadow and true self stop being intellectual ideas and start being felt realities. You notice the subtle ways you edit yourself before speaking, the automatic responses that come from habit rather than choice, the dreams you dismiss before they fully form. Compassion begins here, not as something we extend to others, but as something we offer ourselves. The realization that every adaptation, every defense, every hidden part served a purpose. They weren't mistakes, they were survival strategies. The invisible self wasn't hiding from you, it was protecting you. The work isn't about exposing these hidden parts to the world. It's about welcoming them back into your own awareness. The sensitivity you learn to armor becomes your capacity for empathy. The anger you learn to suppress becomes your boundary-setting energy. The creativity you called impractical becomes your unique way of seeing the world. This integration feels less like adding something new and more like remembering something ancient. Like coming home to a house you forgot you owned. The furniture is familiar. The light falls in patterns you recognize. Even the dust feels like part of the story. The invisible self doesn't want to take over your life. It wants to enrich it, to add depth to your relationships, meaning to your work, authenticity to your presence. It's the part of you that knows when to speak and when to listen, when to act and when to wait, when to connect and when to retreat. As we make space for these previously hidden aspects, something shifts in our experience of loneliness. The ache doesn't disappear, but it transforms. It becomes less about missing others and more about missing ourselves. Less about being unseen and more about the parts of ourselves we haven't yet learned to see. This is the gentle paradox of the invisible self. The more we acknowledge what we've hidden, the less hidden we feel. The more we listen to our inner whispers, the less alone we become. Not because we've found someone who understands us completely, but because we've begun to understand ourselves. The room is quiet again, but the silence feels different now. Less empty, more full. The invisible self hasn't disappeared. It has simply stopped hiding. It breathes with you, moves with you, sees the world through your eyes. Integration isn't about becoming perfectly whole or completely transparent. It's about making peace with the fact that we will always have hidden depths, private thoughts, unspoken feelings, that some parts of us will only ever be known to ourselves, and that this isn't a failure of intimacy, but its necessary condition. The invisible self becomes not what separates us from others, but what connects us to ourselves. It's the internal compass that guides us when external markers fail, the inner wisdom that speaks when logic falls silent. the creative impulse that emerges when plans dissolve. We stop trying to eliminate our shadows and start appreciating how they give dimension to our light. We stop fighting our complexity and start honoring it. The contradictions don't disappear, but they stop feeling like conflicts and start feeling like conversations. The most profound relationships aren't those where we're completely known, but those where we feel safe enough to reveal what we're still discovering about ourselves. Where the space between two people becomes large enough to contain both what's visible and what's not. Where being seen doesn't require full exposure. The invisible self teaches us that some truths are too delicate for words, some experiences too profound for explanation, that the most authentic connections often happen in the spaces between what's said and what's felt. In the glance that understands without analyzing, the silence that comforts without explaining. We carry our invisible selves not as burdens, but as treasures. The private memories that shape us, the secret hopes that sustain us, the unspoken truths that ground us. These aren't deficiencies in our relationships. They're the foundations of our individuality. In the end, being seen begins with seeing ourselves. Not just the parts we're proud of, but the parts we've kept hidden. The vulnerabilities, the contradictions, the mysteries. The invisible self isn't waiting to be fixed or exposed. It's waiting to be welcomed home. And in that homecoming, we discover that we were never alone to begin with. That the most constant companion, the most understanding witness, the most faithful friend has been with us all along, waiting patiently in the quiet spaces, listening to the stories only we can tell.